Sinking, written by Yu Dafu, translated by Joseph S.M. Lau and C.T. Hsia. Lately, he had been feeling pitifully lonesome. His emotional preciosity had placed him at a constant odds with his fellow men, and inevitably the wall separating him from them had grown gradually thicker and thicker. The weather had been cooling off day by day, and it had been almost 2 weeks since the school started. It was September 22nd that day. The sky was one patch of cloudless blue. The bright sun, timeless and eternal, was still making its daily circuit on its familiar track. A gentle breeze from the south, fragrant as nectar, brushed against his face. Amidst the half-ripened rice fields, or on the meandering highways of the countryside, he had been seen strolling with pocketed edition of Wordsworth. On this great plain not a single soul was near, but then a dog's barking was heard, softened and reverent, melodious by distance. He lifted his eyes from the book, and glancing in the direction of the barking, saw a cluster of trees and a few houses. The tiles of their roofs glittered like fish scales, and above them floated a thin layer of mist like a dancing ribbon of gossamer. "Oh, you serene gossamer, you beautiful gossamer," he explained, and for reasons unknown even to himself, his eyes were suddenly filled with tears. After watching the scene absently for a while, he caught from behind him a whiff suggestive of violets. A little herbaceous plant rustling in the breeze had set forth this scent and broken his dreamy spell. He turned. The plant was still quivering, and the gentle breeze, dense with the fragrance of violets, blew on his pallid face. In the crisp early autumn weather, in this bright and pellucid ether, his body felt soothed and languid, as if under a mild intoxication. He felt as if he were sleeping in the lap of another mother, or being transported to the beach blossom spring in a dream, or else reclining his head on the knees of his beloved for an afternoon nap on the coast of southern Europe. Looking around, he felt that every tree and every plant was smiling at him, turning his gaze to the azure sky. He felt that nature herself, timeless and eternal, was nodding to him and greeting. And after staring at the sky fixedly for a while, he seemed to see a group of little winged angels with bows and arrows on their shoulders, dancing up in the air. He was overjoyed and could not help soliloquizing. "This, then, is your refuge. When all the Philistines envy you, sneer at you, and treat you like a fool, only nature, only this eternally bright sun and azure sky, this late summer breeze, this early autumn air, still remains your friend, still remains your mother and your beloved. With this you have no further need to join the world of the shallow and flippant. You might as well spend the rest of your life in the simple countryside, in the bosom of nature." Talking in this fashion, he began to pity himself, as if 1,000 sorrows and grievances, finding no immediate expression, were weighing upon his heart. He directed his tearful eye to the book. "Behold her, single in the field, you solitary highland lass, reaping and singing by herself. Stop here, or gently pass. Alone she cuts and binds the grain, and sings a melancholy strain. Oh, listen, for the vale profound is overflowing with the sound." After reading through the first stanza, for no apparent reason, he turned a page and started on a third. Will no one tell me what she sings? Perhaps the plaintive numbers flow for old, unhappy, far-off things and battles long ago. Or is it some more humble lay, familiar matter of today? Some natural sorrow, loss, or pain that has been and may be again. It has been his recent habit to read out of sequence. With books over a few hundred pages, it was only natural that he had seldom had the patience to finish them. But even with the slender volumes like Emerson's Nature or Thoreau's Excursion, he never bothered to read them from beginning to end at one sitting. Most of the time, when he picked up a book, he would be so moved by its opening lines for the first 2 pages that he literally wanted to swallow the whole volume. But after 3 or 4 pages, he would want to savor it slowly and would say to himself, "I mustn't gulp down such a marvelous book at one sitting. Instead, I should chew it over a long period of time. For my enthusiasm for the book will be gone the moment I am through with it, so will my expectation and dream, and won't that be a crime?" Every time he closed a book, he made a similar excuse for himself. The real reason was that he had already grown a little tired of it. However, a few days or even few hours later, he would pick up another book and began to read it with the same kind of enthusiasm. And naturally, the one that had touched him so much a few hours or days earlier would now be forgotten. He raised his voice and read aloud once more these 2 stanzas of Wordsworth. Suddenly it occurred to him that he should render the solitary reaper in Chinese. After orally translating these two stanzas in one breath, he suddenly felt that he had done something silly and started to reproach himself. Isn't it insipid as the hymns sung in church? English poetry is English poetry and Chinese poetry is Chinese poetry. Why bother to translate? After saying this unwittingly, he smiled a little. Somewhat to his surprise, as he looked around, the sun was already on its way down. On the western horizons across the great plains floated a tall mountain wrapped in its mist, which, saturated with the setting sun, showed a color neither quite purple nor quite red. While he was standing in a daze, a cough from behind his back signaled the arrival of a peasant. He turned around and immediately assumed the melancholy expression as if afraid to show his smile before strangers. His melancholy was getting worse with time. To him, the school textbooks were insipid tasting as wax, dull and lifeless. On Sunday days, he would take a favorite work of literature and escape to a secluded place on the mountain or by the sea to relish the full joy of solitude. When all was silent about him at a place where sky and water met, he would now regard the plants, insects, and fish around him, and now gaze at the white clouds and blue sky and feel as if he were a sage or hermit who had proudly detached himself from the world. Sometimes, when he ran into a peasant in the mountain, he would imagine himself Zarathustra and would repeat Zarathustra's saying before the peasant. His megalomania, in exact proportion to his hypochondria, was thus intensified each day. Small wonder that, in such a mood, he didn't feel like going to school and applying himself to mechanical work. Sometimes he would skip classes for 4 or 5 days in a row. And when he was in school, he had the feeling that everyone was staring at him. He made every effort to dodge his fellow students, but wherever he went, he just couldn't shake off that uncomfortable suspicion that their malevolent gazes were still fixed on him. When he attended classes, even though he was in the midst of all of his classmates, he always felt lonely. And the kind of solitude he felt in press of people was more unbearable by far than the kind he experienced when alone. Looking around, he always found his fellow students engrossed in the instructor's lecture. Only he, despite his physical presence in the classroom, was wandering far and wide in a state of reverie. At long, the last bell rang. After the instructor had left, all the classmates were as lively and high-spirited as swallows newly returned in spring, chattering, joking, and laughing. Only he kept his brows knit and uttered not a sound. As if his tongue were tethered to a 1,000-ton rock, he would have liked to chat with his fellow students, but perhaps, discouraged by his sorrowful countenance, they all shunned his company, and went their ways in pursuit of pleasure. For this reason, his resentment towards them intensified. They're all Japanese, all my enemies. I'll have my revenge one day. I'll get even with them. He would take comfort in this thought whenever he felt miserable, but in a better mood, he would reproach himself. They are Japanese, and of course they don't have any sympathy for you. It's because you want their sympathy and that you have grown to hate them. Isn't this your own mistake? Among his more sympathetic fellow students, some did approach him, intending to start a conversation. But although he was very grateful and would have liked to open his heart to them, in the end he wouldn't say anything. As a result, even they respected his wishes and kept away from him. Whenever his Japanese schoolmates laughed and joked in his presence, his face would redden because he thought the laughter and jokes were at his expense. He would also flush if, while conversing, one of these students glanced at him. Thus, the distance between him and the schoolmates became greater each day. They all thought him a loner and avoided his presence. One day after school, he was walking back to his inn, satchel in hand. Alongside him were 3 Japanese students heading in the same direction. Just as he was about to reach the inn, there suddenly appeared before him 2 girl students in red skirts. His breathing quickened, for girl students were a rare sight in this rural area. As the 2 girls tried to get by, the 3 Japanese boys accosted them. "Where are you going?" Coquettishly, the 2 girls answered, don't know." The 3 students all laughed, pleased with themselves. He alone hurried back to his inn, as if he had done the accosting. Once in his room, he dropped the satchel on his tatami floor and lay down for a rest. The Japanese sit as well as sleep on the tatami. His heart was still beating wildly. Placing one hand underneath his head and another on his chest, he cursed himself. "You coward fellow, you are too coward. If you are so shy, what's there for you to regret? If you now regret your cowardice, why didn't you summon enough courage to talk to the girls? Oh, coward, coward." Suddenly he remembered their eyes, their bright and lively eyes. They had really seemed to register a note of happy surprise on seeing them. Second thought on the matter, however, prompted him to cry out, "Oh, you fool! Even if they had Even if they seemed interested, what are they to you? Isn't it quite clear that their ogling was intended for the three Japanese? Oh, the girls must have known. They must have known that I am a Chinaman. Otherwise, why didn't they even look at me once? Revenge. Revenge! I must seek revenge against their insult. At this point in his monologue, a few icy teardrops rolled down his burning cheek. He was in utmost agony. That night he put down his diary. Why did I come to Japan? Why did I come here to pursue my studies? Since you have come, is it a wonder that the Japanese treat you with contempt? China, oh my China! Why don't you grow rich and strong? I cannot bear the shame in silence any longer. Isn't the scenery in China as beautiful? Aren't the girls in China as pretty? Then why did I come to this island country in the eastern seas? And even if I accept the fact that I am here, there is no reason why I should have entered this cursed high school. Those who have returned to China after studying only 5 months here, aren't they now enjoying their success and prosperity? How can I bear the 5 or 6 years that still lie ahead of me? And how can I be sure that even if I manage to finish my long years of studies despite the 1,000 vexations and hardships, I would be in any way better off than those so-called returned students who came here simply for fun? One may live to 100, but this youth lasts only 7 or 8 years. What a pity that I should have to spend these purest and most beautiful 7 or 8 years in this unfeeling island country, and at last I am already 21. Dead as dried wood at 21, dead as cold ash at 21. Far better for me to turn into some kind of mineral, for it's unlikely that I will ever bloom. I want neither knowledge nor fame. All I want is a heart that can understand and comfort me, a warm and passionate heart, and the sympathy that it generates, and the love born of that sympathy. What I want is love. If there were one beautiful woman who understood my suffering, I would be willing to die for her. If there were one woman who could love me sincerely, I would also be willing to die for her, be she beautiful or ugly. For what I want is love from the opposite sex. Oh yes, heavens above, I want neither knowledge nor fame, nor useless lucre. I shall be wholly content if you grant me an Eve from the Garden of Eden, allowing me to possess her body and soul. His home was in a small town in the Fushan River, about 80 or 90 li from Hsia. The river originates in Anhui and wanders through the length of Zhejiang. Because it traverses a long track of variegated landscape, a poet of the Tang dynasty wrote in admiration that the whole river looks like a painting. When he was 14, he had asked one of his teachers to write down the line of 4 characters for him and had it pasted on the wall of his study. His study was not a big one, but since through its small window he could view the river in its ever-changing guises, rain and shine, morning and evening, spring and autumn, it has been to him as good as Prince Tang's tall pavilion. And in the small study he had spent more than 10 years coming with his elder brother to Japan for study. When he was 3, his father had passed away, leaving the family in severe poverty. His elder brother, however, managed to graduate from W University in Japan, and upon his return to Beijing, he earned the Jinshi degree and was appointed to a position in the Ministry of Justice. But in less than 2 years, the Republican Revolution started in Wuchang. He himself had by then finished grade school and was changing from one middle school to another. All his family reproved him for his restlessness and lack of perseverance. In his own view, however, he was different from the other students and ought not to have studied the same prescribed courses through the same sequence of grades. Thus, in less than half a year, he transferred from the middle school in the city of K to one in H, where unfortunately he stayed less than 3 months owing to the outbreak of the revolution. Deprived of his schooling in the city H, he could only return to his own little study. In the spring of the following year, he was enrolled at the preparatory class for H College on the outskirts of Hangzhou. He was then 17, founded by the American Presbyterian Church. The college was notorious for its despotic administration and the menial freedom it allowed its students. On Wednesday evenings, they were required to attend Vespers. On Sundays, they were not allowed to go out or to read secular books. They could only pray, sing psalm, or read the Old and New Testaments. They were also required to attend chapel every morning from 9 to 9:20. The delinquent student would get demerits and lower grades. It was only natural that, as a lover of freedom, he chafed under such superstitious restrictions. Fond as he was of the beautiful scenery around the campus, he had not been there half a year when a cook in the employ of the college, counting on the president's backing, went so far as to beat up students. Some of his more indigenous schoolmates went to the president to complain, only to be told that they were in the wrong. Finding this and similar injustices altogether intolerable, he quit the school and returned to his own little study. It was then early June. He had been home for more than 3 months when autumn winds reached the Fushan River, and the leaves of the trees on its banks were about to fall. Then he took a junk down the river to go to Hangzhou, where he understood. The W Middle School at the Stone Arch was then recruiting transfer students. He went to see the principal, Mr. M, and his wife, and told them of his experience at H College. Mr. M allowed him to enroll in the senior class. It turned out, however, that this W Middle School was also church-supported, and that this Mr. M was also muddle-headed American missionary. And academically, this school was not even comparable to the preparatory class at H College. After a quarrel with the academic dean, a contemptible character and a graduate of H College as well, he left W Middle School in the spring. Since there was no other school in Hangzhou to his liking, he made no plans to be admitted elsewhere. It was also at this time that his elder brother was forced to resign his position in Beijing. Being an upright man of strict propriety and better educated than most of his colleagues in the ministry, he had invited the fear of envy. One day, a personal friend of a certain vice minister asked for a post, and he stubbornly refused to give him one. As a result, the vice minister disagreed with him on certain matters, and in a few days he resigned his post to serve in the judicial yuan. His second elder brother was at the time an army officer stationed in Shaxing. He was steeped in the habits of the military and therefore loved to squander money and associate with younger gallants. Because these three brothers happened at the same time to be not doing too well, the idlers in their hometown began to speculate whether their misfortune was a geomantic nature. After he returned home, he shut himself in his study all day and sought some guidance and companionship at the library of his grandfather, father, and elder brother. The number of poems he wrote in his diary began to grow. On occasion, he wrote stories in an ornate style, featuring himself as a romantic knight-errant and the two daughters of the window next door as children of nobility. Naturally, the scenic descriptions in these stories were simply idyllic pictures of his hometown. Sometimes, when the mood struck him, he would translate his own story in some foreign language, employing the simple vocabulary at his command. In a word, he was more and more enveloped in the world of fantasy, and it was probably during this time that the seeds of his hypochondria were sown. He stayed home almost 6 months. In the middle of July, however, he got a letter from his elder brother saying the judicial yuan had recently decided to send me to Japan to study its judicial system. My acceptance has already been forwarded to the minister, and a formal appointment is expected in a few days. I will, however, go home first and stay for a while before leaving for Japan. Since I don't think idling at home will do you any good this time, I shall take you with me to Japan. This letter made him long for his brother's return. Though he did not arrive from Beijing with his wife until the later part of September, after a month's stay, they sailed with him for Japan. Though he was not yet awakened from his dreams of the romantic age upon his arrival in Tokyo, he nevertheless managed to pass the entrance examination for Tokyo's first high school after half a year. He would be in his 19th year in the fall. When the first high school was about to open, his elder brother received word from the ministry that he should return. Thus his brother left him in the care of a Japanese family, and a few days later returned with his wife and newborn daughter. The first high school had set up preparatory programs especially for Chinese students, so that upon completing that program in a year, they could enroll along with the Japanese students in regular courses of study in the high school of their choice. When he first got to the program, his intended major was literature. However, when he was about to complete the course, he changed to medicine, mainly under pressure from his brother, but also because he didn't care much either way. After completing his preparatory studies, he requested that he be sent to the high school in N City, partly because he had heard it was the newest such school in Japan, and partly because N City was noted for its beautiful women. In the evening of August 29th, in the 20th year of his life, he took a night train all by himself from Tokyo's central station to N City. It was probably the 3rd or 4th day of the 7th month in the old calendar. A sky the color of indigo velvet was studded with stars. The crescent moon, hooked in the western corner of the sky, looked like untinted eyebrows of a celestial maiden sitting by the window of a third-class coach. He silently counted the lights in the house outside as the train steadily surged ahead through the black mist of the night. The lights of the great metropolis got dimmer and dimmer until they disappeared from his ken. Suddenly his heart was overtaken by 1,000 melancholy thoughts, and his eyes were again moist with warm tears. "Sentimental, too sentimental," he exclaimed. Then, drying his tears, he felt like mocking himself. "You don't have a single sweetheart, brother, or close friend in Tokyo, so for whom are you shedding your tears? Perhaps grieving for your past life, or feeling sad because you lived there for the last 2 years, but haven't you been saying you don't care for Tokyo?" "Oh, but how can one help being attached to a place even after living there for only 1 year? The Orioles know me well because I have long lived there. When I'm getting ready to leave, they keep crying 4 or 5 sad notes at a time." Then his rambling thoughts turned to the first Puritans embarking for America. I imagine that those cross-bearing expatriates were no less grief-stricken than I am now when sailing off the coast of their old country. The train had now passed Yokohama, and his emotions began to quiet down. After collecting himself for a while, he placed a postcard on top of his volume of Heine's poetry, and with a pencil composed a poem intended for a friend in Tokyo. The crescent barely rising above the willows, I again left home for a distant horizon, first pausing in the roadside tavern crowded with revelers, then taking off in a carriage as the street lights receded. A youth inured to partings and sorrows has few tears to shed. The luggage from a poor home consists only of old books. At night the reeds find their roots stirred by autumn waters. May you get my message at South Bank. Then, after resting for a while, he read some of Heine's poetry under a dim light bulb. Lebet well, glat and sol. Lebet wal, glat and sale. Glat herring, glat fron. Auf die berg wil ik stigen. Lekend of ik nederschochen. But with the monotonous sound of the wheels pounding against his eardrums, in less than 30 minutes he was transported into a land of dreams. At 5 o'clock, dawn began to break. Peering through the window, he was able to discern a thread of blue making its way out of the nocturnal darkness. He then stuck his head out the window and saw a picturesque scene wrapped in a haze. "So it's going to be another day of nice autumn weather," he thought. "How fortunate am I?" An hour later, the train arrived at N City's railroad station. Alighting from the train, he saw at the station a Japanese youth wearing a cap marked by 2 white stripes, and knew him for a student of the high school. He walked towards him, lifting his cap slightly. "How do I find the X high school?" The student answered, "Let's go there together." So with the students, he left the station and took a trolley in front of its entrance. The morning was still young, and shops in N City were not yet open. After passing through several desolate streets, they got off in front of Crane Dance Park. "In the school far from here?" he asked. "About 2 li." The sun had risen, and by the time they were walking the narrow path between the rice fields after crossing the park, but the dewdrops were still on the rice stalks, bright as a pearl. Across the fields in the front were clusters of trees shading some scattered farmhouses. 2 or 3 chimneys rising above these structures seemed to float in the early morning air, and bluish smoke, emanating from them, curled in the sky like incense. He knew that the farmers were preparing breakfast. He inquired at an inn close to the school, and was informed that a few pieces of luggage sent out the previous week had already arrived. The innkeeper, used to Chinese lodgers, gave him a hearty welcome. After unpacking, he had the feeling that the days ahead promised much joy and pleasure. But all his hopes for the future were mocked by reality. That very evening, his hometown, however small, was a busy little town, and while had often felt lonely amid large throngs in Tokyo, nevertheless, the kind of city life there was not too different from what he had been accustomed to since childhood. Now this inn, situated in the countryside of N City, was far too isolated. To the left of its front door was a narrow path cutting across the rice fields. Only a square pond to the west of the inn provided some diversity to the scene. Since school had not yet begun, students had not yet returned, and thus he was the only guest in the spacious hostel. It was still not too unbearable in the day, but that evening, when he pushed open the window to look out, everywhere was pitch darkness. For the countryside of N City was a large plain, with nothing to obstruct one's view. A few lights were visible in the distance, now bright and now dim, lending to the view of a spectral quality. Up above the ceiling, he could hear the scampering rats fighting for food, while outside the window several wutong trees would rustle whenever there was a breeze. Because his room was on the second floor, The rattle of the leaves sounded so close that he was frightened almost to the point of tears. He had never felt a stronger nostalgia than that evening. He got to know more people after school started, and his extremely sensitive nature also became adapted to pastoral environment. In less than 3 months, he had become nature's child, no longer separable from the pleasures of his countryside. His school was located on the outskirts of N City, which, as has already been mentioned, were nothing but open fields offering the unobstructed vision of broad horizons. At the time, Japan was not so industrialized or populous as it is now. Hence, this large area of open space around the school, diversified only by clumps of trees and little knolls and mounds, except for a few stationery shops and restaurants serving the needs of new students. There were no stores in the neighborhood. A few inns, however, dotted the cultivated fields in this mainly untilled wilderness. After supper, he would put his black serge cloak and a favorite book in hand, take a walk into the lingering glow of the setting sun. Most probably, it was during these idyllic wanderings that he developed his passion for nature. So at a time when competition was not keen as today, and leisure was as plentiful as Middle Ages, he spent half a year of a dreamlike existence in a quiet retreat, simple in its manners and uncontaminated by the presence of Philistines. These happy days and months seemed to go by in a flash. The weather was now getting milder, and the grass was turning green under the influence of warm breezes. The young shoots in the wheat fields near the inn were growing taller inch by inch. With all nature responding to the call of spring, he too felt keenly the urge implanted in him by the progenitors of the human race. Unflaggingly, he would sin every morning underneath his quilt. He was ordinarily a very self-respecting and clean person, but when evil thoughts seized hold of him, numbing his intellect and paralyzing his conscience, he was no longer able to observe the admonition that one must not harm one's body under any circumstance, since it is inherited from one's parents. Every time he sinned, he felt bitter remorse and vowed not to transgress again, but almost without exception, the same visions appeared before him vividly. At the same time, the next morning, all those descendants of Eve he would normally meet in the course of a day came to seduce him in all their nakedness, and the figure of a middle-aged madame appeared to him even more tempting than that of a virgin. Inevitably, after a hard struggle, he succumbed to temptation, thus once, twice, and this practice became a habit. Quite often, after abusing himself, he would go to the library and look up medical references on the subject. They all said without exception that practice was most harmful to one's health. After the fear increased, one day he learned somewhere that in a book that Gogol, the founder of modern Russian literature, had also suffered from sickness and was not able to cure himself. To the day of his death, this discovery comforted him somewhat, if only because no less a man than an author of Dead Souls was his fellow sinner. But this form of self-deception would do little to remove the worry in his heart. Since he was very much concerned about his health, he now took a bath and had some milk, several raw eggs every day, but he couldn't help feeling ashamed of himself when taking his bath or having his milk and eggs. All this was clear evidence of his sin. He felt that his health was declining day by day, and his memory weakening. He became shy and especially uncomfortable in the presence of women. He grew to loathe textbooks and turned increasingly to French naturalistic novels, as well as few Chinese novels noted for their pornography. These he now read and reread so many times that he could almost recite them from memory. On the infrequent occasion when he turned out a good poem, he became overjoyed, believing that his brain had not yet been damaged. He would then swear to himself, "My brain is all right, since I can still compose such a good poem. I mustn't do that sort of thing again. The past I can no longer help, but I shall control myself in the future. If I don't sin again, my brain will be in good shape." But when the critical moment came each morning, he again forgot his own words. On every Thursday or Friday, or on the 26th and the 27th of each month, he abandoned himself to this pleasure without a qualm, for he thought that he would be able to stop by the next Monday or the next month. Sometimes, when he happened to have a haircut or bath on a Saturday evening, or the evening of the last day of the month, he would take that as a sign of his reformation, but only a few days later he would resume his diet of milk and eggs. Hardly a day passed in which he was not troubled for his own fears as well as his sense of guilt, and his hypochondria worsened. He remained in such a condition for about 2 months, and then the summer vacation began. However, he suffered even worse during the 2-month vacation than before. By the time school resumed, his cheekbones had become more prominent and bluish-gray circles around his eyes even bigger, and his once bright pupils and expressionless as those of dead fish. Again, it was the fall. The big blue firmament seemed to be suspended higher and higher each day. The rice fields around his inn had now turned to the color of gold. When the chilly winds of the morning or evening cut into his skin like a dagger, he knew that bright autumn days were not far behind him. The week before, he had taken along the volume of the Wordsworth and strolled on the path of the field for a whole afternoon. From that day on, he had not been able to free himself from the spell of his cyclic hypochondria. Moreover, the two girl students he had met a few days before stayed in his memory, and he couldn't help blushing whenever they called that encounter. Recently, wherever he went, he was uneasy. At school, he had a feeling that his Japanese classmates were avoiding him, and he no longer wanted to visit his Chinese classmates, simply because after each visit, his heart felt all the more empty. Those Chinese friends of his, hard as they tried, still couldn't understand his state of mind. Before each visit, he expected to win their sympathy, but as it happened, no sooner had they exchanged a few words than he began to regret his visit. There was one, however, whose conversation he enjoyed, and sometimes he told him all about his private and public life. On his way home, however, he always regretted having talked so much and ended up a little worse state of self-reproach than before. For this reason, a rumor circulated among his Chinese friends that he was mentally ill. When the rumor reached out, he wanted as much to avenge himself on these few Chinese friends as on his Japanese schoolmates. He was finally so alienated from the Chinese that he wouldn't even greet them when he met them in the street or on campus. Naturally, he didn't attend any of the meetings for Chinese students, so that he had become virtual enemies. Among these Chinese students, there was one eccentric, probably because there was something reprehensible about his marriage. He seemed to take particular delight in malicious gossip, partly as a means to covering up his own immoral conduct, and it was none other than his eccentric who had spread the rumor that he was mentally ill. His loneliness became most intolerable after he had cut himself off from the social contacts. Fortunately, the innkeeper's daughter held some attraction for him, for otherwise he could really have committed suicide. She was just 17 and had an oblong face and big eyes. When she smiled, she showed 2 dimples and 1 gold tooth, and quite often she put a smile on her face, confident of its charm. Although he was very fond of her, when she came in to make his bed or deliver his meals, he always put on an air of aloofness. And however badly he wanted to talk to her, he never did, because he could hardly breathe in front of her. To avoid this insufferable agony, he had lately tried to leave his room as soon as she entered it. But the more he tried to avoid her, the more he longed for her. One Saturday evening, all the other students in the inn had gone to N City to amuse themselves. For economic reasons, he did not go. He returned to his room following a brief after-dinner stroll around the pond on the west side, but it was difficult for him to stay by himself on the deserted second floor, and soon he got impatient and wanted to go out again. To leave this place, however, meant passing the door of the innkeeper's room, which was situated right by the main entrance, and he remembered when he returned that the innkeeper and his daughter were just having dinner, and that this thought he had no longer had the desire to go out again, since seeing her would mean another torturing experience. Instead, he took out a novel by George Gissing and started to read, but before he had finished 3 or 4 pages, he heard, in dead silence, the splashing of water. He held his breath and listened for a while. As soon as he started panting, and his face turned red. After some moments of hesitation, he pushed open the door quietly and, taking off his slippers, went down the stairs stealthily. With equal caution, he pushed open the door to the toilet and stood by its glass window to peer into the bathroom. The bathroom was adjacent to the toilet. Through the glass window, one could see the goings-on in the bathroom. At first, he thought it would be content with just a glance, but what he saw in the next room kept him completely nailed down. Those snow-white breasts, those voluptuous thighs, and that curvaceous figure. Bow chicka wow wow. Holding his breath, he took a close look at the girl, and a muscle in his face began to twitch. Finally, he became so overwrought that his forehead hit the window pane. The naked Eve then asked across the stream, "Who is it?" Without making a sound, he hurriedly left the toilet and rushed upstairs, back into his room. He felt his face burning and his mouth parched. To punish himself, he kept snapping his own face while taking out the bedding to get ready for sleep. He could hardly fall asleep. After tossing and turning under the quilt for a while, he strained his ears and concentrated all his attention on the movements downstairs. The splashing had stopped, and he heard the bathroom door open. And judging by the sound of her footsteps, he was positive she was coming upstairs. Immediately, he buried his face beneath the quilt and listened for the whisper of his inner voice. "She's already outside the door." He felt as if all the blood were rushing to his head. Certainly, he was now in a state of unusual excitement, compounded by fear, shame, and joy. But if someone had asked him at the moment, he would have denied that he was filled with joy. Holding his breath, he strained his ears and listened. All was quiet on the other side of the door. He coughed deliberately, still no response. But just as he was getting puzzled, he heard her voice downstairs talking to her father. Hard as he tried, he was so tense that his palms were soaked in sweat. He still couldn't make out anything she was saying. Presently, her father roared with laughter. Burying his head under the quilt, he said through his clenched teeth, "So she told him. She told him." He didn't get a wink of sleep that night. Early in the morning, he stole downstairs to make a quick toilet and rushed out of the inn. It was not yet time for the innkeeper's daughter to get up. The sun was rising, but the dew-drenched dust on the road had not yet dried. Without knowing exactly where to go, he headed east and before long saw a peasant pushing a vegetable cart coming his way. "Good morning," the peasant greeted him. As far as their shoulders brushed, this took him by surprise, and immediately his emaciated face flushed red. He wondered, so he always knows my secret? After walking hurriedly with no sense of direction for a long while, he turned his head and saw that he was already a great distance from his school. The sun had now risen. He wanted to determine the time, but could not do so, since he had forgotten to take his silver pocket watch along. Judging by the position of the sun, it was probably about 9 o'clock. He was hungry but unwilling to go back and face the innkeeper and his daughter. Though he had on him was 12 cents, hardly enough for a decent snack. Finally, he bought from the grocery village store 12 cents worth of food, intending to eat it in a nook unseen by others. He kept walking until he reached a crossroad. There were very few pedestrians on the side path running from north to south, since the south side sloped downward. Flanked by 2 preciples, he knew that the path had been dug out of the hill. Thus the crossroads was the tip of the hill, while the main path on which he had been walking was its ridge, and the intersecting path sloped in 2 directions following the hill's contour. He paused at the crossroads for a while, and then came upon a large plain that he knew would lead to the city. Across the plain was a dense grove where he thought the Shinto temple was located. When he had reached the end of the path, he saw that there had stood upon the left bank a parapet encircling a few cottages. Above the door of one of these cottages hung a tablet inscribed with the Chinese character Zhang Zhu Hai, Sea of Fragrant Snow. He walked up a few steps to the entrance of the parapet, and with one push opened both sides of the door. Stepping casually inside, he found a winding path leading uphill, flanked by a great many old May tree, and knew for sure that this was a mere grove. He walked up the northern slope along this winding path until he reached the hilltop, where he saw stretching before him a plateau of great scenic beauty. From the foot of the hill, the plateau, the whole grove covering the surface of the slope was most tastefully planned. West of the plateau was a precipice which faced another across the gulf, and down below was the narrow pathway he had just traversed. Along the edge of this precipice were a 2-story house and several cottages. Since all the doors and windows were tightly shut, he knew that they were restaurants and taverns, open only during the season of the May blossoms. In front of the 2-story house was a lawn with a ring of white rocks, and inside the ring an old May tree crouched on its gnarled trunk. At the outer edge of the lawn, marking the beginning of the southern slope, stood a stone tablet recording the history of the grove. He sat on the grass in front of the tablet and started eating the food he had bought at the grocery store. He sat on the lawn for a while, even after he had finished breakfast. There were no human voices, only from the trees in the farther distance came the occasional chirping of birds. Gazing at the azure sky, he felt that everything around him, the trees, house, the lawns, and birds, was being equally nourished by nature. Under the benign influence of the sun, in face all of this, his memory of last night's sin vanished like a boat sailing beyond the outer rim of the sea. From the plateau to the end of the downhill slope, there were many little winding paths. He got up and walked randomly among these until he came to a cottage situated midway down the slope, surrounded by May trees. Nearby on the east side was an ancient well covered with a heap of pine needles. He turned the handle of the pump several times trying to draw some water, but the machine only creaked and no water came up. He thought, probably this grove is open only during the flowering season. No wonder there's no around. Then he murmured as another thought flashed him, since the grove is unoccupied, why not I go and ask the owner if I could lodge here for a while? This decided, he rushed downhill to look for the owner. He came near the entrance and ran into a peasant, around 50 years of age, coming onto the grove. He apologized and then inquired, "Do you know who owns this place?" "It's under my management." Where do you live? Over there. The peasant pointed to a little house on the west of the main path. Following his direction, he saw the house on the far end of the western precipice and nodded to acknowledge its existence. Then he asked, "Can you rent me the 2-story house inside the grove?" "Sure, but are you by yourself?" "Yes." "Then you might as well save yourself the trouble." "Why?" "Because I have had student tenants before and they hardly stayed more than 10 days before they moved out, probably because they couldn't stand the solitude. I'm quite different from the others. I don't mind the solitude as long as you agree to rent the place to me." "I can't think of any reason why not. When do you want to move in?" "How about this afternoon? It's all right with me." "Then may I trouble you to clean it before I move in?" "Certainly, certainly. Goodbye." "Goodbye." After he had moved to the May Grove, his hypochondria took a different turn. Over some trivial matters, he had started a quarrel with his elder brother, which prompted him to mail to Beijing a long, long letter, severing ties of kinship. But after the letter was sent, he mused for many an hour in front of his house. He thought he was the most miserable man in the world. Actually, he was the one to blame for this fraternal split. But precisely because a quarrel of this sort is usually more bitter than a quarrel among friends, he hated his brother, like a viper or scorpion. When he was humiliated, he would reason thus: "If even my own brother could be so unkind to me, how can I blame others?" After reaching this conclusion, he would review all the unkind things that he imagined his brother had done to him and declare that his brother was bad and he himself was good. He would then itemize his own virtues and list all the past wrongs and sufferings in an exaggerated fashion. When he had proved to his own satisfaction that was indeed the most miserable of all men, his tears would course down like a waterfall. A soft voice would seem to be speaking to him from the sky. "Oh, so it's you who are crying. It's really a shame that such a kind-hearted person as you should be so maltreated by the world. But let it be, since it has been decreed by heaven. And you'd better stop crying, since it won't do your health any good." When he heard this voice, he would feel greatly relieved. There seemed to be infinite wisdom in chewing the cud of bitter sorrow. As means of retaliation, he gave up his study of medicine and switched to literature, intending this change of major to be a declaration of war. Since it was his brother who had urged him to study medicine, also changing his major would delay his graduation for a year, which meant shortening his life by 1 year, and the sooner he died, the easier it would be to maintain a lifelong enmity towards his brother. For he was quite afraid that he would be reconciled with his brother in a year or two, and he would change his major to help strengthen his family enmity. The weather had gradually turned colder. It had been a month since he moved up the hill. In the past few days, the clouds hung heavily in the somber sky, and when the frosty northern winds came, the leaves on the May tree would begin to fall. Upon moving his retreat, he had sold some old books to buy cooking utensils and had made his own meals for nearly a month. Now that it was getting chillier, he gave up cooking and ate at the grove keeper's house down the hill. Like a retired monk idling in a temple, he had nothing to do but to blame others and reproach himself. One morning he got up very early. Pushing open the window facing the east, he saw a few curls of red cloud floating in the far horizon. The sky directly above was a patch of reddish silver gray because it had drizzled the day before. He found the rising sun all the more lovely. He went down the slope and fetched water from the ancient well. After washing his face and hands with the water, he felt full of energy and ran upstairs for a volume of Hang Zhang's poetry. He kept pacing along the winding paths in the grove as he chanted the poetry. Soon the sun was up in the sky. Looking southward from the plateau, he could see at the foot of the hill a large plain checkered in the rice fields. The unharvested grain, ripened to a yellowish gold, gave a most brilliant reflection of the morning sun against the background of a violet sky. The scene reminded him of a royal painting by Millet. Faced with this magnificence of nature, he felt like an early Christian of Jesus' time and could not help laughing at his own pettiness. "Forgive, forgive. I have forgiven all ye who have wronged me. Come ye, and all make peace with me." As he was contemplating with a book of poems, he had tears in his eyes. As he was contemplating with a book of poems in his hand, he had tears in his eyes. The beauty of the autumnal scene, and thus getting lost in thought, all of a sudden he heard two whispering voices close by him. "You have to come tonight." It was clearly a man's voice. "I want to, but I'm afraid." It was a girl's seductive voice, and he felt instantly electrified as he had circulation as if his circulation had stopped. Looking around, he found himself standing by a growth of tall reeds. He was on its right, and the couple was probably on its left, completely oblivious of his existence. "You are so kind. Do come tonight, because we haven't..." "In bed," the man continued. He heard the noise made by the other's suckling lips, and immediately he prostrated himself on the ground, as stealthily as a wild dog was a stolen morsel in its mouth. "Oh, shame, shame," he cursed himself severely in his heart. "How can he be so depraved?" Nevertheless, he was all ears, listening to what they were doing and saying. The crunching of falling leaves on the ground, the noise of undressing, the man's rapid pants, the sucking of lips, and the woman's pleading in half-audible broken tones, "Please, please hurry. Otherwise, we'll be seen." Instantly, his complexion turned ash gray. His eyes reddened with fire, and his upper teeth clattered against his lower. He could hardly get up, let alone run away from the scene. He was transfixed in agony. He waited there until a couple had left before he went back to his bedroom upstairs. Like a drenched dog, covered himself with a quilt. Without bothering with lunch, he slept until 4 o'clock, until the whole area was suffused with the late afternoon sun. In the distance, a thin veil of smoke was seen floating leisurely on top of the trees across the plain. Hurriedly, he ran downhill to get on the road and headed south for no apparent reason. He eventually crossed the plain to arrive on the trolley stop in front of a temple. A trolley came by just then, and he boarded it without knowing why he should be taking the trolley or where it was going. After running for 15 or 16 minutes, the trolley stopped, and the operator asked him to change cars, so he took another trolley. 20 or 30 minutes later, it reached its last stop, and so he got off. He found himself standing by a harbor. In front of him was the sea, lazing in the afternoon sun, smiling. Across the sea to the south was the silhouette of a mountain floating hazily in the translucent air. To the west was a long dike, stretching to the middle of the bay. A lighthouse stood beyond the dike like a giant. A few tethered boats and sampans were moving slightly, while a number of buoys farther out on the bay shone red on the water. The wind carried from a distance broken snatches of conversation, but he was unable to tell what it was about or where it came from. After pacing aimlessly for a while on the bank, he suddenly heard something that sounded like chimes. He went over and saw the musical signal was designed to attract customers to the ferry. Soon, a steamboat came by from the opposite side, following a middle-aged worker. He too boarded the ferry. No sooner had he landed on the eastern bank than he found himself in front of a villa. The door was wide open, showing a courtyard neatly decorated with lawn, flowering plants, and miniature hills made of rocks. Without finding out the identity of the place, he simply walked in and was immediately greeted by a very sweet feminine voice. "Please come in." Taken by surprise, he stood there in dazed and thought, "This is probably some kind of restaurant, but I have heard of a place like this cannot be without prostitutes." At the thought of this, he became invigorated, as if drenched by a bucket full of water. But he soon changed color because he didn't know what to do with himself, whether to advance or retreat. It was a pity that he had the lust of an ape and the timidity of a rabbit, which accounted for his present quandary. "Come in, please do come in," the seductive voice called from the hall again, accompanied by giggles. "You devils. You think I'm too timid to come in?" he said to himself in anger, his face burning hot, stamping his feet lightly. He advanced, gnashing his teeth and clenching his fist, as preparing to declare war on these young waitresses, but hard as he tried, he couldn't possibly erase the flush of red and blue on his face, nor compose its twitching muscles. So when he came near the girls, he almost cried like a child, "Please come upstairs." Bracing himself, he followed a waitress of around 17 or 18 upstairs and felt somewhat calmer. A few steps on the second floor, and he came into a dark corridor. Immediately his nostrils were assaulted by a strange mixture of perfume, of face powder, and hair tonic, and the special kind of bodily fragrance that distinguished Japanese women. He felt dizzy, and sparks floated before his eyes, which made him reel. After steadying himself, he saw emerging from the darkness in front of him the oblong, powdered face of a woman who asked, with a smile, "Would you like to have a place by the sea, or did you have a special place in mind?" He felt the woman's warm breath upon his face and inhaled deeply, without being aware of what he was doing, but as soon as he became conscious of his action, his face reddened. With great effort, he mumbled an answer. "I'll take a room facing the sea." After taking him to a small room by the sea, the waitress asked him what kind of food he would like, and he answered, "Just bring a few dishes of whatever you have ready." "You want some wine?" "Yes." After the waitress had left, he stood up and pushed open the paper window to let in some fresh air, for the room was stuffy and her perfumed presence lingered on, suffocating him. The bay was calm. A light breeze passed by the surface of the sea was wrinkled into those series of waves that, under the reflection of this settling sun, glinted like the scales of a golden fish. After watching the scene from the window for a while, he was moved to whisper a line of poetry. The setting has crimsoned my seaside chamber. Looking westward, he saw that the sun was now fully about 10 feet from the horizon, but however the beautiful scene, his thoughts were still with the waitress, the fragrance emanating from her mouth, hair, face, and body. After repeated attempts to engage his mind elsewhere, he resigned himself to the fact that in his present mood, he was obsessed with flesh rather than poetry. Before long, the waitress brought his food and wine. She squatted by him and served him most attentively. He wanted to look closely at her and confide in all of his troubles, but in reality, he didn't even dare look at her in the eye, much less talk to her. So like a mute, all he did was look furtively at her delicate white hands resting upon her knee, and at the portion of a pink petticoat not covered by her kimono. For Japanese women wear a short petticoat instead of drawers. On the outside, they wear a buttonless long-sleeve kimono with a band about 14 inches around the waist fastened to a square bundle on the back. Because of this costume, with every step they take, the kimono is flung open to reveal a pink petticoat inside and a glimpse of plump thighs. This is special charm of a Japanese woman, to which he paid most attention whenever he saw them on the streets. It was because of this habit, too, that he called himself a beast, a sneaky dog, a despicable coward. It was specifically the corner of the waitress's petticoat that was perturbing him. The more he wanted to talk to her, the more tongue-tied he became. His embarrassment was apparently making the waitress a little impatient, for she asked, "Where are you from?" At this point, his pallid face rendered again. He stammered and stammered, but couldn't give a forthright answer. He was once again standing on the guillotine, for the Japanese look down upon Chinese, just as we look down upon pigs and dogs. They call us Shinajin, Chinamen, a term more derogatory than knave in Chinese. And now we had to confess before this pretty young girl that he was a Shinajin. "Oh China, my China, why don't you grow strong?" His body was trembling convulsively, and tears were running down the roll of his face. Seeing him in such agitation, the waitress thought it would be best to leave him to drink alone, so that he would compose himself. So she said, "You must almost finish this bottle. I'll get you another one." In a while, he heard the waitress coming upstairs. He thought she was coming back to him, and so he changed his sitting position and adjusted his clothes, but he was deceived, for she was only taking some other guest to the room next to his. Soon he heard the guest flirting with the waitress, who said coquettishly, "Please behave, we have a guest in the next room." This infuriated him, and he cursed them silently. "Bastards, pigs, how dare you bully me like this? Revenge, revenge, I'll revenge myself on you. Can there be any true-hearted girls in the world? You faithless waitress, how dare you desert me like this? Oh, let it be, for from now I shall care nothing about women, absolutely nothing. I will love nothing but my country, and let my country be my love." He had an impulse to go home and apply himself to study. At the same time, however, he was envious of those bastards next door, and there was still a secret corner in his heart that expected the waitress's return. Finally, he suppressed his finger and silently downed a few cups of wine, which made him feel warm all over. He got up and opened more windows to cool himself off, and saw that the sun was going down now. Then he drank a few more cups and watched the gradual blurring of the seascapes. The shadow cast by the lighthouse on the dike was getting longer and longer, and a descending fog began to blend the sky and the sea. But behind this hazy veil, the setting was lingering. The setting sun lingered on the horizon, as if reluctant to say goodbye. After watching his view for a while, he felt inexplicably merry and burst out laughing. He rubbed his burning cheeks, muttered, "Yes, I'm drunk, I'm drunk." The waitress finally came in, seeing him flushing and laughing idiotically in front of the window. She asked, "With the windows wide open, aren't you afraid of the cold?" I'm not cold at all. Who can afford to miss this beautiful sunset?" "You're indeed a poet. Here's your wine." "Poet? Yes, I'm a poet. Bring me a brush and some paper, and I'll write a poem for you." After the waitress had left, he was surprised at himself and thought, "How have I become so bold all of a sudden?" He became even merrier after attempting more cups of the newly warmed wine, and broke into another round of Japanese laughter. In the next room, those bastards were singing Japanese songs aloud. And so he raised his voice and chanted, "Drunk Drunk, I tap the railing and feel the chillier because of wine. Rivers and lakes again turn bleak in the death of winter. The mad poet, with his profound pity for the parrot, was spared through death, his bones buried in the central province. The further ignominy of another talented youth, exiled to Chang'an with the title of Grand Tutor. It's not too hard to try to repay a life-saving meal with 1,000 pieces of gold, but now many could pass through the capital without heaving 5 long sighs. Looking homeward across the misted sea, I too weep for my beloved country. When he woke up, he found himself lying underneath a red satin quilt scented with a strange perfume. The room was not large, but with no longer the same room he had occupied the late afternoon. A 10-watt bulb suspended from the ceiling gave dim light. A teapot and 2 cups were placed beside his pillow. After helping himself to 2 or 3 cups of tea, he got up and walked unsteadily to the door. As he was opening it, the same waitress who had taken care of him the afternoon came to greet him. "Hey there, are you all right now?" He nodded and answered with a smile, "Yes. Where's the toilet?" "I'll show you." He followed her and again passed through the corridor, but it was now lit up, and from far and near came singing and laughter and the sound of the samisen. All of this helped him to recall what had happened this afternoon, especially what he had said to the waitress when in the drunken state. His face flushed again. Returning from the toilet, he asked the waitress, "Is this quilt yours?" "Yes," she answered with a smile. "What time is it now?" "Probably 8:45 or 8:50. "Would you please give me the check?" "Yes, sir." After he paid the bill, trembling, he handed the waitress a banknote and said, "No thanks, I don't need it." He knew that she was offended by the small tip again with the embarrassment. He searched his pockets and found 1 remaining note. He gave it to her, saying, "I hope you won't scorn this paltry sum. Please take it." His hands trembled more violently this time, and even his voice quivered. Seeing him in this state, the waitress accepted the money and said in a low voice, "Thank you." He ran straight downstairs, put on his shoes, and went outside. The night air was very cold. It was probably the 8th or 9th of the lunar month, and the half moon hung high in the left corner of the grayish blue sky, accompanied by a few lone stars. He took a walk by the seashore. From afar, the lights on the fishermen's boats seemed to be beckoning him, like the will-o'-the-wisp. The waves under the silvery moonlight seemed to be winking at him like the eyes of a mountain spirits. Suddenly, he had the inexplicable urge to drown himself in the sea. He felt in his pocket and found that he didn't have any money for the trolley fare. Reflecting upon what he had done today, he couldn't help cursing himself out. How could I have gone to such a place? I really have become a most degraded person, but it's too late for the regrets. I may as well end my life here, since I'll probably never get to the kind of love I want. And what would life be without love? Isn't it as dead as ashes? This dreary life, how dull and dry. Everyone in the world hates me, mistreats me. Even my own brother is trying to push me off the edge of this world. How can I make a living, and why should I stay on this world suffering? This thought gave him a pause, and the tears began to roll down his face, which was now pallid as a dead man's face. He didn't even bother to wipe away the tears, which glistened on his moon-blanched face like the morning dew on the leaves. With anguish, he turned his head to look at the elongated shadow of his thin body. "My poor shadow, you have followed me for 21 years, and now this sea is going to bury you. Though my body has been insulated and injured, I should not have let you grow so thin and frail. Oh shadow, my shadow, please forgive me." He looked towards the west. The light on the lighthouse was doing its job, now beaming red and now green. When the green beam reached down, there would immediately appear on the sea an illuminated path of light blue. Again, looking up, he saw a bright star trembling in the farthest reaches of the western horizon. Underneath that shaky star lies my country, my birthplace, where I have spent 18 years of my life. But alas, my homeland, I shall see you no more. Such were his despondent, self-pitying thoughts as he walked back and forth along the shore. After a while, he paused to look again at the bright star in the western sky, and tears poured down like a shower. The view around him began to blur. Drying his tears, he stood still and uttered a long sigh. Then he said between pauses, "O China, my China, you are the cause of my death. I wish you could become rich and strong soon. Many, many of your children are still suffering." Pretty mid.